you. In this lecture, we're going to learn about diversity in the workplace. We're going to learn that we're going to often interact with people who are different than us. And that's a good thing. We want to be able to have a world where people are not the same, and that difference is not seen as a bad thing, but as a good thing, as a way of enhancing diversity and being able to have options and different possibilities for being a certain way. So one of the things that we just have to learn, and what this lecture is going to be about, is what are these dimensions of diversity and how exactly we should interact in it. So first, let me give you a little scenario. Suppose you are working and the following people entered into your store. So how would you interact with this person if they entered into your store? Or how would you interact with this person if they entered into your store? And how would you interact with this person if they entered into your store? Now, part of dealing and interacting with diversity is making sure that whoever walks into our store, we can treat them with the greatest amount of respect possible. But we also recognize that people are different and that sometimes people will have different needs. So what are the standard things? What are some good principles that we can learn, so that way whoever walks in, you can serve them with the greatest amount of respect possible, and not only that, but to have good interactions so they become a customer and a repeat customer. So here's what we're going to do in this lecture. We're going to first learn about types of diversity, and then we're going to learn some interaction factors that we should take into account as we approach diversity. And then I'm going to discuss 8 dimensions of diversity, 8 different dimensions that create who we are as people in terms of our social identity. First, types of diversity. There are 3 general types of diversity that you can have within an organization. First, you have functional diversity. Functional diversity is having a range of skills available to a team by bringing people with diverse backgrounds and skill sets. So functional diversity is all about bringing people with different skill sets into a group or into a team and having them bounce off each other to create something unique and innovative. So that's generally a good type of diversity to have in any team. Have people who have a certain skill set in one area and then another person in a skill set in a different area, and have them work together. But there's also personality diversity. This is for where people have different personalities and tendencies. So you might have somebody who is more introverted, or somebody who's more extroverted, or somebody who's more math-oriented, and somebody who's more science-oriented, or somebody who's more passive, somebody versus somebody who's more aggressive. So you want to have different personalities, because if you have, for example, a lot of passive people, nobody's going to want to step up and take the lead. Or if you have all people who are dominant figures, then everyone's going to fight for the leadership role, and then you're going to have too many cooks in the kitchen, if you will. But the third type of diversity, and the one that we're going to be focusing on for this lecture, is demographic diversity. This is having different demographic backgrounds. So people from different races, different classes, mixing genders, and so forth, to allow a workplace that has different backgrounds represented in its interaction with people and in development of its products and services. So that's a little bit about types of diversity. Now, when we're dealing with demographic diversity, there are some interaction factors that you have to take into account. The first is you have to take into account salience. So one of the questions that comes into play whenever you're learning about diversity and how to interact with diversity is that anytime you have intercultural communication generally, so whether that's between cultures or between genders and so forth, it's not always the case that it's a different interaction where you have to act super differently between each group. Sometimes interactions, the salience of the intercultural aspect or the salience of the intergender aspect may not be that high. When we talk about salience, we're talking about how much the cultural backgrounds and perceptions of the participants impact the exchange directly. It's very possible to have an intercultural exchange, for example, where the two different cultural backgrounds have very low salience. That means that the cultural backgrounds don't really matter because the nature of the interaction is so basic or minimal that it just doesn't affect anything. So perhaps you are checking out items at the gas station, and you go up to the register and you buy a 6-pack of Dr. Pepper. And so when you get to the register, you just put the 6-pack on the scanner. The person says, okay, $12.50, and you pay $12.50 and you exit. Probably not a lot of intercultural comm going on there. There's just not a lot of salience between the backgrounds. But if you do something more complicated, then let's say you're negotiating a deal to develop some real estate in another country, there's probably going to be more salience there, more than likely. But then you also have to factor in common ground, that there is also communication that isn't intercultural, and there is communication that does not necessarily always bring in or highlight social identity differences when there's a lot of common ground between people. So, in fact, a lot of times people have more in common than they have differences. And so if there's enough common ground in the interaction for people to interact and understand each other, it may not be the case that you might not have to act so differently around the person. But then there's this other thing and this other factor that you have to take into account when we talk about difference, and especially the 8 dimensions of differences. And that is intersectionality. So it sounds like a scary big term, but all intersectionality means is that people are multidimensional and have an interplay of several, or intersection of several different demographics. In other words, first you have a gender, and then you have an age and generation. Like there is no option out of that. You have a specific socioeconomic status. You have a certain race, and so forth. And so you're an intersection of a particular gender, of a particular race, of a particular age, of a particular generation, of a particular language, and all of those particular identities come together and intersect, and that helps define the kind of experience that you have with interacting with people and interacting with the world. So no single label can explain a person's identity, perceptions, and behaviors entirely. One label might speak a little bit to it, but you have to recognize that there are other factors that help define your experience in the world and with others, and that's called intersectionality. And so I'm going to be talking about 8 different dimensions, so eight different categories that you fall into automatically, and how those categories interact. And then lastly, we want to avoid the problem of stereotyping. A stereotype is just preconceived beliefs about what a group believes or does. So here's the problem that sometimes occurs in diversity training and such, and intercultural comm, that we want to avoid. So if you look here, this is a person. Let's just pretend it's just a person generally. And I have here the foreground, okay? So this is you interacting with a person. Now, in the background of this person has culture, they have a specific race and ethnicity, they have a certain gender, they have a certain sexual orientation, they belong to a certain class, they may or may not have certain disabilities, they speak a certain language, and they belong to a certain age and generation. Now, here's what we do not want to do when we look at intercultural communication. What we do not want to do is say this: because John is from C culture, John automatically believes X, Y, and Z. We don't want to do that because that is a stereotype. We don't want to stereotype people and say, because somebody belongs to a certain class, that therefore they believe X, Y, Z, and B, and we don't need to ask them any questions. We don't want to do that. That is all stereotyping. But here's what we want to do. What we want to be able to do, because remember, sometimes cultural and all these background factors do become salient, but sometimes they do not. What we want to be able to do is this, essentially. let me just get to my pen here. In your everyday interactions, you're going to interact with the foreground. You're going to interact with the person. And you're just going to treat them well like you would anyone else. You'll smile. You'll ask them, how can I help you? You'll greet them. You'll be friendly to them. And you'll do all those things. Now, if you notice that they do something that is maybe different than what you expect. So maybe when you say, hi, how can I help you? They're very direct and straightforward, and they're just like, take me to this place, okay? Rather than just assuming the person is rude, perhaps this person comes from a direct culture where they tend to do away with those niceties and just want to be straightforward and to the point. So instead, we're going to interact with the foreground first and just have the interaction. If any sort of dimension of difference becomes salient, we will use our background knowledge to help make sense of whatever difference or thing that occurred. So if somebody, does the whole like direct and doesn't really do the niceties, rather than just saying that person is rude, if you know a little bit about cultural differences, you might say, actually, I don't think it's that they're rude, it's just that they're from a different culture, so I need to just be a little bit more understanding about that. And maybe I'll adjust my interaction to suit them a little bit more. So it's the same thing with any of the other categories. We don't want to stereotype, but what we want to do is let people present to us how they normally present themselves, and then use our background knowledge of all of these different factors to help us make sense of any behaviors that maybe don't meet our expectations or maybe are just we're not used to. And using that background knowledge to help govern how we should interact with this person and also make sense of their behaviors. So that's what we're trying to do here. That's what I hope that this lecture will do, is just give you that background knowledge about each of these categories, how they might affect your interactions, but not necessarily stereotype and tell you that all people act this way, or all people believe X, or all people do Y, because it's always a little bit more complicated than that. And you're an intersection of all of these things, so all of these things have to come into play when you're looking at those kinds of factors. So there are two goals of this lecture. The first is to increase your awareness of the range of differences among yourself and other people. That's my first stated goal. I wrote it out word for word so everybody knows what I'm trying to do here. So the first thing is you have to be aware of the range of differences that exists in this world. So, and that's where the 8 dimensions are going to come into play. But I'm also going to give you background information about these differences. And what I hope this background information will do is refine your judgments. So be more understanding of why people may act differently than you or do things that may not make sense to you initially. And also refine your interactions with others so then you know how to respond to them accordingly and hopefully in a respectful way. Now, here's what this is not, and this is like a little bit of a disclaimer. The first thing is that this is not an exhaustive overview of every difference. Like, this could be a semester-long course, this whole lecture. I mean, because we could really go into the nitty-gritty of every demographic and really come to deep understandings of every struggle that groups that have. And but for this, just for time purposes, this is just an overview of differences. And I know that there's going to be things that I may be leaving out or could go more in depth on. But for now, let's just get the ball rolling with just an overview of the differences. The second thing is groups are not monolithic. So when we talk about cultures, for example, it doesn't mean when you say that Ecuador is more of a collectivistic culture, it doesn't necessarily mean that every Ecuadorian is collectivistic. There could still be disagreements within Ecuador. There could be regional differences. And you may have somebody who doesn't like collectivism, that maybe they grew up in that culture, but they hated it. And now they want to be more individualistic. So groups are not monolithic. There can be disagreements. And often that's part of what groups are trying to figure out within their own political discussions is how do we want to represent ourselves? And groups do change their position. So when we talk about language and like how to reference certain groups in a more respectful way, these things can change. And just as we learn more, as more history gets shared and such, groups might change those things. But lastly, this is just description of difference. It's not evaluation of difference. So I don't want anyone to feel like that this is a political move by any means, because we're not discussing whether difference is good or not. We're not saying the government should do X about difference or the government should do Y about difference. We're just saying, look, difference exists, so here's what you should know about it. Whether you like it or not is a whole other issue. Okay, so there's no politics in this. We're not evaluating government action. We're not doing any of that stuff. All we're doing is saying, this is a person, and you are a person. Here's how two people should interact. And here's how you can do a better job of interacting with people. This is about people interacting with people. This is not about politics and policy. Okay. That's it for that. Now, there are 8 dimensions of diversity, and this is a preview slide of all the 8 dimensions. The first is ability, and we're going to go in detail for each of these. Ability, and then you have gender. So ability, gender, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, culture, class, generation, and age. So those are the 8 dimensions of diversity that we're going to talk about. Now, you belong in a category in all 8 of these. You have a certain ability level. You are a certain gender. You do have a certain sexual orientation. You do belong to a certain race and ethnicity. You do belong to a certain culture. You do belong to a certain class. You are part of a generation, and you do have an age, right? And assuming you're alive, right? I assume you're alive. Okay, so you do have a mix of all of these things. So let's go into the first one, which is ability. When we talk about disability, we're talking about any condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. So the CDC defines it as having 3 criteria. There's got to be an impairment, so something that is related to the body or mind that makes it more difficult for somebody to do some certain activities. So that's called activity limitations. So the impairment has to lead to some kind of activity limitation, and it limits their interaction with the world, and so it restricts their ability to participate in certain things. So that's how the CDC defines disability. Now, there's a whole range of disabilities that people can have. People can have vision disabilities, so that's where blindness is an example. People can have movement disabilities, so that can be people who have wheelchairs, or who use wheelchairs, or you could have people who do not have limbs or are missing a limb. So like war veterans, for example. You can have thinking disabilities. So maybe somebody is not cognitively able to think at the same level as somebody else. Some people have remembering disabilities. So if somebody has dementia, they're going to have a disability now because they're not going to be able to remember things as easily. Some people have learning disabilities. They're not able to catch on to things as quickly as other people, so they're going to have a learning disability. Some people have communicating disabilities. So this can be related to being mute, or some forms of autism have this. Some people have a hearing disability. Some people are deaf. Some people have hard of hearing. And then mental health disabilities. So some people have mental health issues that just prevent them from doing certain things. If you have stress and anxiety, that can become a disability to a degree, especially when you're having to test. And then social relationships. Some people have disabilities relating to that, so behavior disorders, or I think autism can also be along these lines. Now, there are challenges that people who have disabilities face. First, 18.7% of the United States population has a disability. So they are more prevalent than you realize. But the thing is, a lot of disabilities are invisible. If somebody has a cognitive disability or a learning disability, that's not something that you can visibly see compared to, say, a movement disability. And so part of the challenge of disabilities is sometimes you have to disclose these things orally. It doesn't become self-evident that somebody has a specific disability unless you get to know them or put them to the test, if you will. So that is something that they have to challenge with. And sometimes somebody has to do a disclosure moment where they have to disclose to an employer that, hey, I have this disability, by the way. So that's a problem. And then receiving accommodations. Sometimes we just don't think too much about people with movement disabilities, for example, or people with anxiety or stress disorders and such. And so these people sometimes have to ask for accommodations. And that can be sometimes embarrassing or a little bit stigmatizing. So creating situations where they don't have to ask for them because they're already provided is what a lot of companies and what we recommend companies try to do to prevent those conversations from having to happen if they can be avoided. So when you refer to people with disabilities, there's some language that would help with respect. Now, the thing is, I'm not like, this isn't about being the language police or passing the PC quiz or whatever, but it's just about respect, right? We're just trying to have better relationships with people. Once again, we're not talking about passing laws here or, anything like that, but we're just talking about when you're talking with people who have disabilities, this is what they prefer, okay? And just treating people with respect. So, first thing is, we like the term accessible parking as opposed to handicap parking, because handicap just highlights what somebody can't do or their state of lacking. People without a disability instead of normal people, okay? Because if you don't have a disability, you're normal, but if you don't, but if you do, then I guess you're not normal, okay? So prefer people without a disability. So the key is to have humanizing language rather than totalizing language. Instead of saying we should say they have a physical disability instead of saying they are quadriplegic or they are disabled. Just say they have a physical disability. So it's separating the disability from totalizing the person. They communicate with the device versus this person's nonverbal. Or they have a disability versus they are disabled. Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself there. And then they have autism versus they are autistic. Okay, so once again, autism becomes just an aspect of them. It's not their whole identity. They have Down syndrome versus they are mentally retarded. I don't hear people say mentally retarded as often anymore, so that's good. They receive special education services as opposed to they are in special education, okay? So we want to just humanize the person and not make the disability their whole identity. Now, let's say somebody with a disability enters your store. Here are some things. Now, it depends on the disability, actually, as to what you should specifically do. But what I've done here is I've just given you some very generic interaction tips. And then if you want more on like, well, how do I interact with somebody who is blind, or how do I interact with somebody who has this? That's where you're going to want to consult further outside sources for in-depth information. Unfortunately, we don't have time to cover every disability and what to do, because that could be a whole training in itself. But here's like some generic things. First, you want to maintain eye contact with the person who has the disability. What you do not want to do is stare at their disability. So if it turns out that, somebody does not have a leg, okay? So they walk on one leg and they have a prosthetic leg for the other. Don't stare at the disability, or don't stare at the prosthetic leg. This also, we'll get to that in a second. When a person comes into the store, and let's say they're trying to open the door, it's better to ask if they need help. What you don't want to do is just assume that somebody who has a disability always needs your help. Because part of their personal growth is also empowerment and letting them be able to do things on their own. But if you think they are struggling with something, then it's okay to go up and say, do you need help with that? Do you need help with the door? And if they want it, then go ahead. But if they say no, then just let them do their work and move on. Okay? So just don't assume because somebody has a disability that they automatically need your help at all times. They may want to have their autonomy still. The third thing is relax. I think sometimes we get nervous, and people get nervous because they're afraid of doing or saying the wrong thing. And just relax. They're just like anybody else overall. If you're interacting with them, they're going to have a personality. They're going to talk to you, and just relax. But don't feel nervous about getting it wrong. And if you make a mistake, apologize. So one of the principles here is life is not about what happens to you. What matters is how you deal with it. And it's the same thing with interacting with difference. It's not what you do. It's how you deal with getting it wrong. If you get it wrong, it's okay. Just apologize, correct the mistake, and move on. But what you just don't want to do is just get it wrong and be like, well, too bad, and just like be insensitive to what they're saying. Okay, so that's a problem. But just, if you get it wrong, it's okay. Just say sorry, move on, okay? Now, you also want to focus on their needs. When somebody comes in to the store, what you don't want to do is ask if they have a disability or ask more questions about their disability. Okay, so just focus on their needs. If they're there to buy a new car, let's say you're selling cars. Okay, well, just focus on the car. Like this is the kind of car they want. Okay, so you don't need to ask them all about the disabilities and all that. Just focus on selling them a car. If they need something related to disability, they'll ask and they'll say, also this or also that, but don't get all inquisitive on them because they may not want to be known for just their disability. And then speak to the person directly. And what I mean is sometimes people who have disabilities will have an assistant with them. So I had a blind student, for example, and he had an assistant with him, but I still talked to the student directly. I didn't just talk to the assistant and then the student was just there. I spoke to the student directly. Obviously, the assistant is there to overhear everything, and that's okay. But you do not want to just speak directly to the assistant, okay? Speak to the person, and even if the assistant's the only one who can really communicate, you still want to show that respect to the person because that way they're still part of the interaction. The assistant knows that they're supposed to be like the third party, not the customer or the student to be the third party. So just talk to the student or the customer as you would normally talk to anyone else. And then just let the assistant chime in as the third party. So take a moment and think about, let's say we have this person coming into our store. How would you interact? So if somebody with a walker comes in, first off, we're going to let him open the door. If it seems like he's struggling, we'll ask if he needs help. Then we'll open the door for him. If he says, he's got it, then he's got it. Okay. And then we'll treat him normally like we would anyone else. So we'll ask him how his day's going, how we can help him. We're not going to stare at his walker. We're just going to talk to him directly. And we're going to treat him like a good person, like everybody else. We love him. We want to take care of him. And we're going to be respectful. So second is gender. Now, there's like two layers to this. So we're going to talk about gender and then we're going to talk about sexual orientation. But for now, we're just talking about specifically gender. And so here are some challenges relating to gender. So this is first, inequalities in pay, C-suite workforce participation, and inequalities in pay, also participation in the C-suite. So it turns out women only make up 4% of CEOs in Fortune 500 companies and only 19% of Congress. And in pay, they still make 23 cents less per hour than men. So, and then workforce participation, often women have lower rates of participation because they have to choose between raising a family or having a career. And so sometimes women will have to leave the workforce to go raise their family because they have to carry the child and such. And that lowers their participation, but also hurts their ability to advance in the career because they take that time off to try to raise their child, and then they lose those years of experience. So those are some challenges for them. Another thing is inclusion in male-dominated social circles. So here's one thing is that sometimes women don't get invited to men's only hangouts at, say, the golf course or bars or, going hunting or anything else. And while it's not a bad thing that men get together and do that, the problem is just that often valuable networking and ideation events happen in those social events. And so women miss out on those networking opportunities or those ideation opportunities. And so that's a problem that women face in male-dominated workforces or male-dominated social circles. And then there's also genderlex. Now, how much men and women differ in communication depends on the research you read. So you've heard probably the thing, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. That's probably a bit extreme now, but still some people hold those beliefs. More and more, I'm hearing more, it's not men are from Mars, women are from Venus. It's more like men are from North Dakota and women are from South Dakota. So there's more similarities than differences. But let's take a look at what some differences may come into play. So one is the difference in expressive versus instrumental implications of communication. So let's say Shannon here says, my boss is blaming me for losing one of our biggest accounts, but it's completely his fault. He never returns our customer calls and he won't help me when our ships delay. Now, if Shannon was talking to her friend Sarah, she might say, that's so unfair. I'm sorry he's blaming you. That's frustrating since it's his fault for all that. So notice here, Shannon expresses a problem, and it's her boss blaming for losing, and Sarah speaks to the emotion and basically validates the emotion. Oh, I'm sorry, that's unfair, that stinks, that's frustrating, and Sarah takes an emotional, expressive response. So Sarah reads this statement as an expressive statement for emotional support. But compare this to what Mark says. Mark says you should call your regional manager and tell her what's going on. Show him the paperwork from the delayed order so she can respond. So if Sarah wasn't here, so let's pretend Sarah wasn't here, what Mark does is Mark gives an instrumental type response. So Mark gives instrumental social support, or actually it's more informational, but still, it's instrumental in that she's giving him advice, he's giving her advice rather than speaking to the emotions. So one of the ideas of gender lex is that sometimes men and women, they speak the same language, but sometimes there's different implications behind things. So in this case, Mark reads Shannon's statement as a request for assistance. So Sarah reads it as a request for validation and support and expressive emotional support, emotional validation. Mark reads it as, oh, she's asking for my advice on how to handle this situation. So these are the kinds of things that gender lex and where gender communication comes into play. What do men and women statistically tend to do? And how do they statistically tend to respond to each other in certain situations? Here are some other axes or dimensions by which men and women can differ. So apology, so men see it as a means of seeking forgiveness or for a transgression. Women say sorry sometimes just as a social smoother or just a way of expressing concern. Men use opposition to test out an idea to improve it. Women sometimes read that as a means of rejecting the idea. And compliments are used as an opportunity for praise and a chance for critique. Sometimes a woman will use them as a chance to return a compliment. And then small talk, focusing on reporting facts and measurements. For women, it focuses on sharing about relationships. So men will focus on, yo, what'd you do yesterday? Oh yeah, I found this fish and it was 10 inches long, and all that, and it's all about facts. And women, it's more like, man, I had this amazing experience yesterday. It was so much fun, blah, blah. Okay. And then power goals might be different too, showing status among friends. So men are trying to one-up each other all the time. Women are trying to find connection. So it's not like all women talk one way and all men talk another way. That's not what we're trying to say with gender talk. It's just that there are different ways to interpret things, and men tend to interpret things a certain way and tend to focus on certain things a certain way, and women tend to focus on certain things a different way, and so forth. And so you can become fluent in both gender talks or in both gender lex. You can understand that sometimes somebody will see a statement like the one we saw before and read it differently than somebody else, and then you'll know how exactly should I be responding to this based on who you're talking to. But one of the things with gender is that we want to try to use gender-neutral language when we're interacting, especially in the workplace. So, for example, when you're addressing a woman, and you probably want to use Miss with the MS dot and not Miss or Mrs. We try to make marital status irrelevant now. I understand back in the day, it used to matter, and you'd have to figure out, was she single or was she married? But nowadays, we just use the neutral Miss. So we take out her marital status being of importance. Use sales representative instead of salesman, right? Because sales rep can be male or female or intersex. Chair instead of chairwoman or chairman. Let's just take the gender out of it. Humankind or people versus mankind. And that's that. Now let's talk about sexual orientation, which is related to gender. So, when we look at gender, there's actually different aspects to it. First, you have your biological sex. So this is the gender that you were assigned at birth based on the shape of your genitalia and such. So this is your chromosomal aspects of your gender and what you physically have. Then you have gender identity. Gender identity is how you identify, is which gender do you identify with. Your gender identity might be different than your biological sex. You may identify and feel like and believe that you are a man when you were born, assigned at birth, the status of a woman. And then there's gender expression. So gender expression is the gender you actually present to people and express to people. So here's the thing. You could be born biologically a female or assigned at birth a female, but you could feel like you're a male. But to get on with society and to interact, you'll still express as a female because you don't want people to know that you really feel like you're a male. Or you might do something like maybe you'll express yourself as a tomboy. So you'll still have some feminine attributes, but you'll have those masculine too, but you'll still consider yourself a girl, even though you feel like a guy, expression-wise, because you want to fit in or you don't want to face stigma and so forth. And then you have sexual orientation, and that speaks to who you are attracted to, gender-wise. Are you attracted to men? Are you attracted to women? Are you attracted to both or neither? So that's where sexual orientation. So gender is a really large category. So that's what we're dealing with here. Now, you can see how this all comes into play then. So you start with I was born as, or I was assigned at birth, either female, intersex, or male. So some people are born with ambiguous genitalia, so it's not fully formed. There are some conditions that will create that, and so you would be intersex. So first you are born as such, and then you identify, though, as female, intersex, or male, and then you express yourself as feminine. Androgynous means like a little bit of both sexes, or just not really clearly one or the other, or masculine. And then you're sexually attracted to women, both, or men. Now, I understand, like, I know on OkCupid, there's like more sexualities other than like homosexual, heterosexual, and bisexual. There's other ones too, like pansexual and sapiosexual and so forth. So, but just for simplicity for this, we could go into detail about that. Just for simplicity for this, we're going to just stick to the three here. So, I was born as, so you can see how this all comes into play. So then you could be born as something, identify as something, express as something, and then be sexually attracted to, depending on what you're sexually attracted to. So you could be born a male, and you could identify as a male and express yourself as a male, but also be attracted to men. So then you would be gay in that case. But you could also be born a male, identify as a male and masculine, and be attracted to women. So then you would be you would just be heterosexual in that case. Or you could be born as female, but you identify as male, and you express yourself as male, and then maybe you're attracted to both sexes. So there's just a lot of combinations that can occur based on your gender and your sexual orientation. The other thing too is, even if you're born as something, you can have reassignment surgery done too. So just because you're born as something physically doesn't mean you're stuck being that forever as well. So I should add that in too, that there is reassignment surgery. Now, there are challenges to sexual orientation. First is the repercussions of coming out. We know that being gay or being lesbian is something that is way more accepted now than probably decades ago, but there's still repercussions for coming out. And so we have to be understanding of that when somebody comes out, that it's a big deal for them. Secondly, there's still bullying and stigma. I mean, just because difference, and some people just, that part of it has to do with sexual orientation is moralized. So when we say moralized, meaning that some groups assign certain sexualities as being right and some as being wrong. And so in the case of homosexuality, some people think that it's wrong. So there's stigma and there's bullying behind that, and there's that. And then there's also language and identification. Sometimes language and how we talk about sexual orientation and how we talk about the different groups can sometimes not be helpful at all. So what we'll do is we'll talk about language when it comes to sexual orientation. So whenever you're talking about sexual orientation, here's what's preferred versus what's dispreferred. So once again, it's just about respect. It's not about legalities or anything like that, or passing a quiz. It's just about being respectful. So first, it's sexual orientation as opposed to sexual preference, because preference makes it sound like, being gay or being straight or being lesbian is a choice, right? So it's more orientation. Your body is oriented towards certain chemical reactions to feeling sexual attraction to a certain group of people. We prefer gay person or gay people when referring to somebody who is gay, as opposed to just homosexuals. So we don't say the homosexuals, that kind of thing. So just, he's a gay person, or he's a gay, there's gay people here, not he's a homosexual, or there's homosexuals here. Okay, so we don't use that. Same-sex relationship instead of homosexual relationship. It's just a little bit nicer to the community. And then transgender people as opposed to transgenders. Okay, so once again, we want to emphasize the humanity aspect of people and not just their totalizing identity. You can say LGBTQ people and their lives. And just so people can, in case you're not aware, LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and then questioning or queer. And then sometimes you'll see IA2, and I is intersex, and A is asexual. What we don't want to say is gay lifestyle, okay? So just LGBTQ people and their lives. Now, interacting with transgender people. So we want to make sure that we're respectful here when we're talking with people who are transgendered. So first, we want to use their preferred name and pronouns. So sometimes they'll make that known right away if they have a preferred name or preferred pronouns. If not, let's say somebody walks into your store and you're not sure what their name, you don't know their name, and you don't know what pronouns to go by because maybe it's not clear. What I recommend first is when you greet them, just ask for their name. So, hi, my name is Dr. Yu. What's your name? If by their name, it sounds like it's a very feminine name, or if it's a very masculine name, you might have a clue then as to what it might be. So you can then kind of know what gender they're expressing as and what they're presenting as. So then you just treat them as such. But if you're still unsure, let's just say it's still not clear to you, because maybe they have a name that's not clearly a gender, or it's just still unclear even by how they look or talk, then just ask for their preferred pronouns or use non-gendered language. So you can ask them, so what do you prefer to go by? Or just use non-gendered language. Call them, I have a customer here who needs help with such and such. Instead of saying, I have a lady or I have a gentleman, just avoid having to even use gendered language in the first place, and then you can go that route as well. But if not, just ask. Just ask what are your preferred pronouns, and that should be fine. If you're unable to ask, then use the pronoun that reflects their expression. So just do your best and just ask if you can. That's the key. And use your name and learn their name, learn about them. And here's the thing. If you make a mistake, and I understand this can happen sometimes, and I think, I can't speak for everyone, but I feel like if you make a mistake, they will probably correct you, and they should be nice about it. I'm sure they will be. As long as you make up for it, as long as you correct yourself, you'll be okay. So here's what I recommend you do. If you make a mistake, let's just say you misgendered somebody, it can happen. It can happen, and we don't want it to happen, but we understand that mistakes do happen. First, you want to apologize. So always apologize. So just say, I'm sorry. And then self-correct. So use the correct pronoun or use the correct name for how they want to go by. Thank them. So just say thank you for letting me know. And then move on to the topic or business that you were moving to. So you could look something like this. I'm sorry, sir. Thank you. Would you like to see our special discount, sir? Okay. So let's say, you thought it was this person was a ma'am, and you said ma'am, and no, it's actually sir. Okay, I'm sorry, sir. Thank you. Would you like to see our special discount, sir? That kind of thing. So just It's not what you do, it's how you deal with it, okay? So it's not whether you make a mistake, it's what you do about the mistake. That's the key thing when you're in these situations. And so just self-correct, apologize, thank, and move on. So, how would you interact with this person if they came into your store? So first thing is, we're going to treat them like everybody else. We're going to smile. We're going to welcome them in. We're going to say, "Hi, how are you doing? My name." And if it's not clear their gender in this case, what they're expressing as, I would ask for their name first. If I can get a clue from maybe their name, then I would go from there, or I would stick to just not using gendered language. And then if I absolutely have to know their pronouns to move forward, then I would maybe ask, if it's still unclear, just what pronouns do you prefer to go by? And then just move on with the interaction. Treat them well, smile, you give them what they need, and enjoy the interaction. Next, we have race and ethnicity. So now we're talking about two different things. First, we have race. So race and ethnicity are two different things. A race is a category of people who share certain inherited physical traits such as skin, color, facial features, and stature. So race tries to be a description, a physical description of people that you can group together. But what we really prefer to use, and this is what sociologists prefer, is ethnicity, because race is not a reliable category to base people off of because of all of the mixing that occurs. So ethnicity is the shared social, cultural, and historical experiences stemming from common national and regional backgrounds that make subgroups of a population different from one another. So it's not necessarily your race per se that makes you different, it's the ethnicity that you identify with. That's where the source of difference comes into play. Now, there are a range of ethnicities. So you have Arab, Asian Pacific Islander, Black African American, Caucasian, Hispanic, Indian, Latinx, Middle Eastern, Native American, and underrepresented. So there's stories, there's all kinds of things that you can learn about every ethnicity, and I wish we had time to just go in detail about each of them, but that's just a quick overview of what some of them are. Now, here are the challenges. First, stereotypes are a huge problem with race and ethnicity. Just assuming that somebody from a certain ethnicity is inclined to do X, is inclined to like Y. So you have positive stereotypes, certain group of people are good at basketball, or a certain group of people are good at math, like all those things. Even if they're positive, they're still stereotypes. Or a certain group of people are up to no good when they're in your store, so watch out for them. Certain group of people come here illegally. All those things are still negative stereotypes. So it's letting people have a blank slate for who they are. So that's why I'm trying to teach you. We're not trying to teach you to stereotype different groups by giving you background information. What we're trying to teach you is, or at least what I'm trying to teach you is, see people for how they present to you, see people for how they act in the specific interaction, but use the background information when you're not sure of what's going on, and to help make sense of what they're doing and why they're doing it, so then you can react accordingly. You also have to worry about biases. Sometimes we think that our group is better than, some race is better than another race, or some race is not as good as another race. So that's where racism comes into play. Racism is basically just in-group biases. And then you have the problem of silos in the workplace. So biases happen in the workplace too, of course. Sometimes we don't hire somebody because we're afraid they're not going to work hard because of the race that they're part of or whatever. And those would all be forms of racism because they're biases. But then you also have the problem of silos. And silos are when groups of people within an organization silo based off of their race. So prisons are known to do this, right? So prisoners will often group up based on their race. So all the Caucasians will sit together at lunch, African Americans will sit together, and so forth. So we don't want to have silos. Now, in workplaces, this can happen too. So you want to make sure there are mixes of people on teams and that you have diversity in your groups so that people have to interact and work together, and we don't have all this siloing and lack of communication between groups that would then reinforce biases and stereotypes. So you really want to mix things up when you're in the workplace. Now, some language practices for race, just out of respect, that's all. Prefer to be specific about when you're referring to somebody, like rather than just saying they're Asian or Oriental, try to get to know them and figure out what their actual ethnicity is and refer them as he's Chinese or he's Korean or he's Japanese, because sometimes that's just calling somebody generally Asian is just too totalizing for some. And definitely don't use Oriental. Latino community as opposed to Mexicans. And in fact, you may even use Latinx community. So if you want, use X. That's the gender neutral of Latino, Latina. African American is preferred to colored person. Now, I understand that there is so if we have to go into political world real fast, there is a coalition called people of color, and these are people from different ethnicities coming together to try to have some core interests represented. But that's generally used within that group. But still, they don't call each other colored people, they're people of color. But we don't generally use that, we don't refer to an individual as a colored person. Then we have Native American as opposed to Indian, so never mix the two. I have seen on some sites from Native Americans, some are okay with American Indian, but to be safe, nobody seems to be offended by Native American. So American Indian's a little bit more risky for some. And then Caucasians as opposed to white people. Okay, so when you're referring to people who are, European, Western European and such, probably Caucasian's the better term to use. Now, on top of an ethnicity, we got to look at language and culture. So culture is defined as the language, values, beliefs, traditions, and customs that people share and listen. So culture is a matrix of how you look at the world and how you value things and believe things and the traditions that brought you up and taught you how to interact with others. So culture helps define how you communicate, because culture gives you the values of what communication means and what communication is for. And culture implants a language that you'll use to communicate with others. So culture says a lot about who you are and helps socialize you and nurture you into becoming the communicator that you are. So there are different dimensions of cultures. So there's emphasis on nonverbal delivery. So there's low context and high context culture. So low context means that you don't need a lot of context to understand the language or the message because it's all said. It's all explicit. So the United States, Canada, Northern European countries would probably be on this end. On the high context culture, where you really have to have a lot of context and nonverbal communication to really understand what was said, most Asian countries, the Middle East, Latin American, and Southern European countries would probably be on this side of the spectrum. Priority of the group over the individual. So you have individualistic societies. So the United States, Canada, and the UK, very individualistic. It's about me. If wearing masks in the pandemic, that takes away my rights. Okay, so that's a very individualistic type of culture, right? So we've had to convince people to wear masks because we're very individualistic about it. But other cultures are collectivistic. Ecuador, Indonesia, Pakistan. It's all about the greater good of the group over the individual. So why wouldn't I wear a mask? Because it's better for the group as a whole. And I want the group as a whole to be better off, not just me. So just very different ways of looking at where the group versus the individual comes in. Now, these are meant to be continuum, so you can have things in the middle here. So I don't mean to say like this is a binary. Like you can have things in the middle. Same with the previous charts as well. Whenever you have something like this, it's a continuum. So there can be things in the middle as well. Acceptance of power inequalities. So what we're talking about here is acceptance of hierarchies and structure of different classes of people. So the United States and Canada are not the lowest. In fact, we do allow some power inequalities. But like Austria, Denmark, and Israel, New Zealand, they would be more egalitarian. On the high power level, like the Philippines, Mexico, Venezuela, India, Singapore, they accept power inequalities far more. They're okay with having structures where some people are at the top and some people are at the bottom, and hey, we just gotta know our place. And then value placed on material success. So some places are very nurturing. So like the Netherlands, for example, would be on one end of this experience. They really want to just nurture you. They want life to be about chilling and just enjoying existing, enjoying being human. Don't worry so much about work. I mean, do have a job. They're not saying don't work, but they're just saying work is not the most important thing in your life. Family, personal development, those kinds of things. But like America, like the United States, would probably be like, hi, no, work, achievement is important. In fact, I remember I was talking with an exchange student back in graduate school, and I asked him, he was from somewhere in India, I don't remember the specific place, but I asked him, what's like the biggest difference you've noticed between the United States and India? And I'll never forget what he said. He said, in India, we work to live. In the United States, you live to work. And I was like, oh, yeah, all right. So yeah, different value placed on material success, different value. And then there's even more dimensions of cultural. So use of language to maintain social harmony. So are cultures more direct? So, America, we're kind of more direct versus indirect, where you don't really want to rock the boat. So when you want to say no, you're going to be very indirect about it. So Japan's a very indirect culture. So if you say like, we should have dinner tomorrow, if instead of them saying, no, I don't want to have dinner, they'll be like, well, that might be a little difficult, or they might say, yeah, I'll think about it. Like something that like they don't want to say no. Okay, so that's much more indirect. Then use of expressive and exaggerative language. So elaborate people tend to be more long-winded in their explanations. They just like to speak more elaborately and expressively. And they might be louder too. And they might have, it's just like way more energetic. So like people in Arabic communities tend to speak this way. The opposite would be like Native American communities. They're very succinct. So Native Americans, some tribal communities value silence a lot. And so if you came in just like, oh my God, blah, 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 and just like, oh, like this guy talks a lot, that kind of thing. And then you have assumption of rapport when speaking to strangers. You have informal. So informal organizations, like you talk to, or of cultures, like you talk to somebody and they talk to you like you've known each other for your whole life, like just instant friendship, those kinds of things. So some people say America is very informal, like we're just really friendly to each other. I was reading that in a British travel guide, like it says, like when you go to America, like people are gonna be really nice to you, and you don't know why, like suddenly, because like, you're just not used to people being so nice. Yeah, we're very informal. Versus formal, where like don't talk to strangers, and when you are, keep your distance, and don't assume too much, just keep it formal, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of dimensions of cultural talk to think about. And just depending on where you grew up and the country you came from and just the communities that you grew up in, like you're going to have a different philosophy of communication compared to other people. And so sometimes when you're in an intercultural interaction, these things will become salient. Sometimes they won't though. Sometimes the interaction will be so basic, or there's just going to be so much common ground between you and the other person that you'll be able to get by no problem. But you got to think about these things when you're dealing with people from a different culture. So here are the challenges. First, there's stereotypes. So stereotypes like some people are lazy, or some groups are rude, or some groups, are just not pleasant to deal with. There's also room for misunderstandings. So like when you're dealing with an indirect culture where they don't say no to things and they prefer to preserve social harmony, you might take it as, oh, well, they're thinking about it, so I should still plan on meeting for dinner tomorrow because they said they're thinking about it and there's a chance, when in fact there was like no chance. They just don't want to say no. So there's misunderstandings there. And then there's language barriers. So a lot of cultures have a language associated with them. And if you don't know the language, then that's a problem. And so how do you deal with language barriers? Well, we'll talk about that. So when you're dealing with interlinguistic interaction, first, let's say you don't know what the person is saying. You can ask them to write down or draw what they're saying because they don't know the language. You can also use your cell phone and just use Google Translate. I know that those apps are getting better about real-time translation while you talk. You can use gestures or pictures. You can use plain language too. And that's one thing, whenever you're talking to non-native speakers, to slow down your talk, because usually the hardest thing for non-native speakers is listening, because they have to be able to quickly translate in their head and then also make sense of the words. And that takes the most highest cognitive load. Reading is the easiest because they can see and recognize the word and then also recall it. And then lastly, you want to keep frustrations and annoyances hidden. So as you work with people who speak a second language or don't speak your language, don't look upset if it's taken them a few times to get things right. You want to still be friendly. You still want to smile. Understand that if it was you in that situation, if you were in a country where nobody spoke English, like you would want patience for you too. So keep those things hidden and put on a nice face and just work with them and serve them. Eventually, once you get through the interaction, they hopefully will buy something or will do business with your company, and then you'll make money and life is good. So how would you interact with this person if they didn't speak your language? So if somebody comes in and you can tell she does not speak English very well. How do you interact? So take a second. Okay, so when they come in, if you notice that they seem to be struggling speaking English, slow down your talk, smile, greet them, all that. Use plain language. If you need to gesture or point at things, go ahead. Or bust out Google Translate, talk that way. And just be as friendly as you can. Be patient with them. Don't get upset. Don't look angry because, they're not understanding what you're saying. Don't go, that kind of stuff. And just be friendly the whole time. Smiling is universally good. Smile at them and just have a great interaction. Okay, next we're going to talk about class. Now you might have seen this picture before. How you look at this person is affected by how you look at this. And you might draw different judgments about this guy if you didn't know this, and vice versa. If you knew this but didn't know that, you'd be surprised. So yeah, that's all part of class and how we present ourselves. So when we talk about class, we're talking about socioeconomic status. So socioeconomic status is composed of two things. First, it's a person's ability to attain goods and services, such as education and healthcare, as well as access to social and informational resources. So somebody of high socioeconomic status can get a lot of stuff. They can get good education, they can get good healthcare, they can get a lot of information, they get social information, they can get into the nice clubs and bars and restaurants and all those things. And they also have power. So socioeconomic status also means that there's a very good ability for your group to acquire resources at the expense of other groups. So because your socioeconomic status is higher and higher and is more renowned, then you'll get access to nicer things, essentially. Now, there's also subjective social status. And subjective social status is your perception of your social class relative to others. Now, this is usually subjective, and it's how you think you are compared to everybody else. So sometimes people don't realize how wealthy they are, and so they think that they're poor, when in fact they're actually really wealthy compared to everyone else. And so you probably have heard of the concept of privilege and check your privilege. So that whole idea is just speaking to the idea, that whole idea is speaking to subjective social status and thinking about how fortunate you really have been given your socioeconomic status in society and what you've been able to take for granted that other people cannot. So subjective social status is all about how you think you are. Now, just because you're high socioeconomic status or low or whatever, or in the middle, doesn't mean that you don't work hard or that, those things. We'll talk about stereotypes regarding that. But here are the dimensions of socioeconomic status. There's 3 dimensions that are generally considered when we talk about dimensions of social economic status. First is education. So you have everything from no diploma. So this would be no diploma. Between this would be high school diploma or equivalent. Then you have the college degree, and then you can talk about the associate's or the bachelor's degree. And then over here, the terminal degree would be the highest degree possible in your field. So part of what affects your socioeconomic status is your education level. And because your education level affects what kinds of jobs you can have, and the higher paying jobs tend to be ones that are higher skill and higher education. If you look at the highest paying jobs in the United States, it's surgeons, dentists, and there's a third one. It's something medical related. So, just look at the list. It's mostly terminal degree oriented jobs. Okay, then you have income. So depending on your income, you fall somewhere on here. So I believe the federal poverty line is now, I think it's $27,000. I should have looked that up before this, but there is a federal poverty line that officially decides or declares that you're in poverty. all the way through, billionaire wealth. Okay, so there's a wide range here. And depending on how much income you have will affect what kind of colleges you go to, what kind of schools. Can you afford private school? Can you afford tutors? Can you afford getting the nicest equipment? Can you afford the nicest computer to do graphic design on? I mean, these are all things where income comes into play. And then occupational prestige. So this is another part of socioeconomic status. How prestigious is your occupation? Because sometimes you can have a college degree and make good money, but your occupation is not well regarded. So maybe you do some kind of shadow economy work. Maybe you're a sex worker and you make good money, but I don't think that's not something you really go around telling people. Or you work for an industry that's not well regarded. Or you're a used car salesperson, for example. So maybe you sell used cars, you have a college degree, and you make a pretty good income, but people don't like used car salespeople. So, so there is that too. How does your prestige play into your status? So here are some challenges with class. First, you have stereotypes. You probably have heard things like poor people are, low-income people are lazy, or rich people are lazy. So you kind of get both ends of the spectrum there. Rich people are lazy, they never worked, or people who have lower incomes are lazy because they don't work. Okay, so there's stereotypes like that. None of them are true, but those are the things that people have to deal with. There's also issues of access. So people who have lower incomes, they don't have the same access to the same resources as people with higher incomes. So once again, people with higher incomes can afford tutors, they can afford putting their kids in the greatest soccer leagues to compete against the greatest players to then become great players in high school. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you cannot do if you don't have money. So access always becomes a problem when it comes to class. And then inclusion. Especially at work, inclusion can become a problem. Let's say your company wants to do a company retreat where you go to a fancy schmancy resort and everybody has to pitch in $1,000 to go to the resort. And you're like, it's a great deal because you get 5 days for $1,000 and you get unlimited massages and blah, 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 and all that. Well, it sounds good, but how many people have $1,000 ready to spend, ready to go? Depending on how much this company pays and like what your pay structure is like, some people may not have that. And even if their pay structure was good, some people still may not have that because they might have kids, they might have debt, there could be all kinds of things. So figuring out how do we make the retreat as inclusive as possible, it may not mean necessarily that we don't have it at the resort anymore, but maybe we come up with some kind of accommodation to help the people who may not be able to immediately afford it. Maybe we'll do a loan system, but maybe no interest, or maybe we'll do a fundraiser for those people. So you got to come up with something to make it inclusive is the key. But what we don't do and what we shouldn't do is just have the retreat, and if you can't afford it, then too bad. So some language practices for class and socioeconomic status. So we prefer to say people who have incomes below the federal poverty line versus poor people, low income people, or low class people, because that's just, it's just kind of totalizing once again. And poor people, you have like a negative word associated with people, like what's poor about them, Prefer to say people who do not have a high school diploma or equivalent versus high school dropouts, right? That's kind of a demeaning way of putting somebody. Sometimes people are not able to finish high school for reasons outside of their control, not necessarily due to lack of achievement or lack of drive. My sister used to teach at an inner city high school, and some kids had to drop out because their parents couldn't afford to pay rent, and so they just needed to work to help support their families. So then she was saying like two of them were really smart and one had a scholarship at Howard University, but she couldn't take it because she couldn't leave her mom, because her mom would have not been able to pay the bills. So these are the kinds of things where it's not always somebody's fault when these things happen. And then we prefer to say people who receive TANF benefits. So TANF stands for Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. We prefer to say that because it's about a service that people are receiving temporarily, because it is called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. But we prefer not to say welfare mothers or welfare reliant. I understand, and we could do a whole thing on welfare like, and all the misconceptions regarding TANF and food stamps and all that. That's like a whole other, like, that's a political science lecture. But I used to work at a career center that worked with this population. So there's just, yeah, politics does not make things better when we talk about this. So, yeah. But anyway, we try to avoid that. Okay. Then lastly, we have generation and age. Now, I've put them together. I understand technically, like, yeah, they should be separate. Like, they should get their own separate, like, slide decks. But I've just put them together because they're so tied. But yes, age does have a physical component as well that we could talk about. But I want to put them together also for, once again, brevity and overview. So here we go. So I'm using the Pew Research on this. What are generations? So generations are groups of people that were born within a specific time frame. So here's how I'm defining the generations based on the Pew Research Center. Okay? So if you were born between 1928 and 1945, you're part of the silent generation. So this is the generation that was too young to fight in World War II. Before the silent generation was the greatest generation, and that was a generation that fought in World War II. But if you were born in 1930, you would have been too young to fight in the war. So they're the silent generation. Then, after World War II ended, all the soldiers and troops came back, world peace came back. That's where you have the baby boomers, and that's where all the houses were bought, and the baby boomers. So between 1946 and 1964, were them. Then once the baby boomers started having kids, that's when Gen X was born. So Gen X was 1965 to 1980. And so Gen X is part of that. Then between 1981 and 1996, you have Generation Y, aka millennials. So millennials were born before the advent of the internet becoming massively popular. Okay, so there were still no cell phones back then. There were still, laptops were really big, and there were car phones and beepers and pagers. But then, starting in 1997 and on, Generation Z was born. And so they're going to be the ones who were mostly born with the internet and cell phones since day one. Even Generation Y millennials, if you were born in 1995, the internet still wasn't big. But by the time you were a child, you would have had it. But Generation Z, 1997 to present, those are the people who are born all connected. Now, here are the challenges as far as intergenerations go in age. There's a difference in cognitive and physical abilities. As you age, so first you're born, right? And then it's all about potential and you gaining abilities, and like they learn to talk, they learn to walk, they learn to count, and it's like all of this possibility. Then you reach a certain age, and I'm not going to try to get into details about the lifespan, but you reach a certain age where then things start to get taken away from you, okay? Because you start to lose some abilities, okay? So you start to lose your memory a little bit. You lose some of your energy starts to diminish. You lose some flexibility. You start to lose muscle mass. So the age part starts to affect your cognitive and physical abilities. So that's a challenge for people of higher ages. And then there's stereotypes about specific age groups, stereotypes about senior citizens, stereotypes about teenagers. And there's also stereotypes about generations. You probably have heard millennials are entitled. I've heard that so many times, and things like that. And so those are all stereotypes. Once again, not true, but you hear it. And then there's different attitudes and motivations. So one thing I'm going to show you a slide here in a second about generational differences as far as attitudes and motivations. And yeah, they change because part of what a generation is, it's a group of people who have grown up in a specific period in history. And that specific period of history has certain technologies available, has certain media presentations going on, has a certain has certain politics, certain people in charge of the government, right, going on, and just a lot of things going on in the environment, like nature, global warming, like Generation Z is going to know nothing but global warming. So it's all that. It's just different attitudes and motivations because they grow up in a different time period in history. So some key differences. Older generations prefer solitary work environments. Millennials tend to prefer collaborative ones. They want to work as a team. Older generations like individual level feedback. Millennials like team level feedback. They like to feel like they're part of a team, and so they want to be evaluated as such. Older generations might prefer PowerPoints, and millennials might prefer interactive presentations. So if you're presenting to a group of millennials, try to make the presentation more interactive. Ask them questions, make jokes, those kinds of things. Now this slide, I'm just going to let you look at, so I'm just going to give you a minute. Here is what I've found in a text on generational differences. So just go ahead and look at this real fast and see what you think. So we have 4 generations here: the silent generation, baby boomer, Generation X, and Generation Y. I haven't found a lot on Generation Z yet because they're just now entering the workforce for most of them. And but hopefully this gives you some ideas of what some perceptions are about generations and how they can differ. So you can even see like Generation X likes get to the point, and Generation Y is like, how come I can just read this online, right? Like, do you need to do this right now? Can I just read the slides or read the PDF, whatever? Okay. And then also, like, you hear that millennials don't like authority. Well, they do like authority, but they just have to earn their respect first. Like, just don't come in and say, I'm in charge, that kind of thing. Like, you have to do something that shows, not just I'm in charge, but you should know a little about my background. Blah, 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 blah. I did this, this, and this. I did this really cool thing. So I'm going to be your manager, and here's what we're going to do, okay? So prove to them and show them that, that you're an authoritative figure. And then, there's a lot to look at here. So when you're adapting to older generations, here are some general tips then. First, try to communicate in a face-to-face manner. Try to monitor your use of slang and tech talk. Avoid stereotyping. So once again, don't do that. Don't assume the worst. And just take advantage of people's knowledge and experience. As I teach adults in the community college, like I know a lot of adults like to chime in with their experience and their knowledge, and that's great. And I encourage it. I think it adds to the classroom experience. And so I love having adult learners in my class. So yeah, I love it. So do the same thing in your workplace. If you're adapting to millennials, be direct with them. So just give them the info that they need and don't need to sugarcoat it. But tell them why. So here's the thing. Whenever you give millennials tasks, they want to feel like that it's important, right? And that they're doing is important. Because millennials want to feel like they're not just a drone in a corporation in a cubicle. They want to feel like they're making a difference and they're making a change. So anytime that you're giving tasks to a millennial group or a millennial generation, try to say why it's important. Not just what to do, but why it's important. So they can get that motivation to really do their best. It's okay to ask for their opinions too. I think millennials want to feel heard. They want to feel like that they have some input in how the organization works. And it's totally fine to have those kinds of conversations with them. Even if they're not management, they still have ideas and somebody should listen. So ask for them. But make them accountable. So make sure they know what the standards are. Give them some specific criteria as to what they need to get done and why and how. And don't be afraid to have casual conversation. So millennials want to feel like they're part of a team, like they're part of a family. Like they just don't want like, oh, I show up at work and I don't talk to them. Like no, they want to feel like they're part of something. And casual conversation is a way to bond and to grow with them. So as a review, we looked at 3 types of diversity. We looked at interaction factors. So remember salience, intersectionality. We looked at groups not being a monolith. And then we looked at 8 dimensions of diversity. So I bring you back to this. You're a mixture of all of these things, of a specific age, generation, a language, a certain ability. You're part of a certain class, education level, income. You're part of a certain culture. You have a certain race and ethnicity. You have a specific gender, and you have a specific sexual orientation. Like I said, I went through a lot of general principles and ideas about differences between groups. But once again, I want you to focus on the foreground first. How does the person present to you? What do they say? What do they do? And react to them that way. But if they do things that don't make sense, or if you're not sure exactly what to do in that circumstance, then go to your background information and use the information that I've given you to help make sense of what they're doing and why, and to help guide your interactions so that you can still have a smooth interaction with them, even if they are different than you. So once again, this is all about just respect and having smooth interactions with people. And you don't have to always like difference, but you just got to be willing to interact with it so you can conduct business and to help people. And hopefully you do. I mean, hopefully you love difference. But the point here, and what we really want you to be able to do at the end of the day, is just have better interactions and to respect other people and to have good relationships, whether you're in the workplace or you're at home. So that's the introduction to diversity. I hope you have some great interactions with all kinds of people.